We all want to live in a healthy environment. So when our environment is threatened in any way, we need to know about it so that we can take steps to make things better. But in the last few years, we've been so obsessed with our physical environment that we've ignored threats to our cultural environment. And in the long run, our cultural environment is every bit as important to our health as the air we breathe and the water we drink, maybe even more important. Hi, I'm Herb Meyer. Our cultural environment is Western civilization. That's who we are. And today, Western civilization is under siege. We're facing a series of attacks, both from outside and from within. And together, these attacks could change the way we live and change the cultural environment that defines who and what we are. And if we don't find a way to resist these attacks, to overcome them, the world we pass along to our children will be very different than the one we live in and much less healthy. Let me show you what I mean. Western civilization started with the Greeks, of course, but it really took off in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. What happened is that Judaism and Christianity reconciled with the modern world. The rabbis, the priests, the scholars, they worked it out with the political powers at the time, and together they paved the way forward. Religion would remain at the center of life, but church and state would be separate. The rule of law, the idea of individual rights, human rights, economic liberty, the scientific revolution itself. All of this is what we mean when we say Western civilization. And it really took off in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries when Judaism and Christianity reconciled with the modern world. And by the way, it ignited the greatest outpouring of art, literature, and music the world has ever known. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Bach. Perhaps the greatest event in Western civilization has been the American Revolution itself. Not because we beat the British, but because in the American Revolution, we overturned forever the relationship between God, the state, and the individual. Before the American Revolution, people understood that power flowed from God to the king, and the king did what he wanted. Our founding fathers said, no, that's not right. Power flows from God to the people, and we, the people, will manage our affairs. That was a revolution. That was one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in human history. Even more important than the idea that the earth was round instead of flat, or that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. That's why the American Revolution is so important to the world even today, more than 200 years later. It isn't because of our military power, our technological prowess, the popularity of our music and our movies around the world, or McDonald's Happy Meals. It's because we're the ones who said power flows to the people. And if we can make a success of it, then there's hope for everyone. Do you remember those Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in Beijing back in 1991? They were pushing forward a papier-mâché model of the Statue of Liberty. That's why. Because to them, America means that power flows to the people. And that's why the American Revolution is the single most important event in all of Western civilization. By the way, everything I've just said about Western civilization, the American Revolution, is rarely taught in our schools. And that's a tragedy. Our children don't even know what Western civilization is. How can they possibly understand when it's under attack or why it's worth defending? Throughout history, Western civilization has come under attack. Sometimes the attacks came from outside, and sometimes they came from within. The first outside attack on Western civilization came in the 7th century from the emergence of Islam. Look, there are millions and millions of Muslims around the world. They are the most wonderful people you'd ever want to meet. They're going about the business, they're raising their children, they're doing their jobs, they're marvelous. Nevertheless, there is within Islam a radical, aggressive streak. And when the radicals are in charge, Islam attacks the West. The first attack came in the 7th century. Islam took over much of France, much of Spain, much of North Africa. Radical Islam hit us again in the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1683, they were literally at the gates of Vienna. Attacks on Western civilization have also come from within. In the 20th century, fascism and communism were murderous, horrible ideologies. They were opposed to everything we in Western civilization believe in, and they came from inside Western civilization, and we had to defeat them both. Today, as we push into the 21st century, Western civilization is simultaneously under attack from outside and from within. The outside attack is what we call the war on terror. In fact, it's the third attack on Western civilization by radical Islam. Terrorism is the tactic that they're using. This isn't like the hot war against fascism in World War II or even the Cold War against the Soviet Union. This isn't a conflict between two political philosophies or two economic systems. In radical Islam, we face an attack by people who believe they have God's sanction to destroy us, and that the more innocent people they kill, the closer they come to heaven. This is something we've not faced in many centuries, and it's going to take us a long time to fight it off. And while we fight off this external attack on Western civilization, we have a couple of attacks coming from within civilization itself. The first of these began in the United States back in the mid-1960s. What happened is that some Americans found themselves uncomfortable with our culture. They didn't like our material success, they didn't like our technological prowess, they didn't like the inequalities of a free market capitalist economy, they didn't like our military power. They were uncomfortable with our traditions, our values, with our morality. So they set out to develop a culture of their own. They tuned out. They developed their own morality. They drove the level of sexual license to something we'd never seen before in this country. They turned to drugs, hard rock music. They simply withdrew into themselves. They were so uncomfortable with the United States, they wouldn't even celebrate our holidays, like July 4th. They developed their own holidays, Earth Day, for example. For a while, these people tuned out. But then they tuned in, and they developed a political agenda, which, if you took it to its logical conclusion, would overthrow the American Revolution itself. We believe that power flows from God to the people. They say there is no God. All power rests with the state. That's very different than anything we understood. In addition to that, they believe that the rule of law is whatever they want it to mean at any given time. If they're doing something that they believe is the right thing to do by their way of judging it, whatever laws they break are okay because their intentions are good. But if we're doing something they judge to be the wrong thing to do, they'll use every legal trick in the books to try and stop us. Besides that, they believe that groups are more important than individuals, that rights are more important than responsibilities, and that somebody's stand on a public issue is more important than their private morality. Over the last couple of decades, a lot of these people have been elected to a lot of offices at the local, state, and federal level, and they've changed our country. It isn't what it used to be. You know, if you have a car and you rip out the leather seats and put in cheap plastic seats, and then you rip out the motor and you put in a less expensive motor, from 50 feet away, it still looks like the same car, but it isn't, is it? That's what's happened to our country. We look the same, but we're not. Today, the federal government takes a larger percentage of our wealth than ever before, much larger than the Founding Fathers ever wanted or imagined could happen. The state plays a greater role in raising our children than ever before, and because regulations are so extensive, the federal government even controls the design of our toilet bowls. I don't think that's what Thomas Jefferson had in mind. The worst thing of all is that we've lost the rule of law. You see, to these people, there is no right or wrong, no good or evil. So how can there be an absolute? Everything is relative. Well, some things really aren't relative. They're absolute. There used to be an old joke where a woman asks her husband one night, "Are you faithful to me?" He thinks for a moment and he says, "Sure I am. Nearly always." Well, it doesn't work like that, does it? You can't say, "Yes, I'm faithful to you," except when I'm in London. Well, it's the same with the rule of law. You cannot have the rule of law 95% of the time, except when the defendant is a famous celebrity or when he's a politician whose poll numbers are so high, nobody wants to convict him. Look at the celebrities who have been acquitted of crimes they're so obviously guilty of. Look what happened in President Clinton's impeachment. He committed perjury, obstruction of justice, and he got away with it because his political popularity was too high. In 2002, in the state of New Jersey, Senator Robert Torricelli wanted to withdraw from the race to make way for another candidate who would be more popular. That was against the New Jersey state constitution, but he was allowed to do it because the popularity of that party was high enough to get away with it. This means we haven't got the rule of law. We've begun to set it aside when it's politically or socially convenient to do so. That's a terrible thing to happen. I don't know what frightens me more, the fact that we've lost the rule of law or that nobody seems to be worried about it. And if losing the rule of law isn't enough to worry about, the unrelenting attack on religion is turning us from a Judeo-Christian culture in the United States into a secular culture, which isn't at all the same thing as the separation of church and state. Now you see why our politics has become so bitter, so personal, so partisan. It isn't politics at all. It's a kind of second civil war. In the first Civil War, states were trying to secede from the United States, and Abraham Lincoln said no. In this Civil War, individuals are trying to impose a different culture on the American culture, and they've come a long way. If they succeed in doing that, Western civilization will end in the United States. And if it ends in the United States, it won't last long anywhere else. In the middle of this, there's yet another attack on Western civilization. This one's begun overseas, in Western Europe and in Japan. What's happened, quite simply, is this. We've stopped breeding, literally. And for a society obsessed by sex, this is amazing. Here's what's happened. If you want a steady population in a country, the birth rate has to be 2.1. That's 2.1 births per woman. You need 2 births to replace the mother and the father, and you need that 0.1 because some children don't live, some children don't grow up and have children of their own. So you've got to have a 2.1 birth rate for a steady population. Today, the birth rate in Western Europe is 1.5. That's 30% below replacement. What that means in real terms is that when my college-age children are my age visiting Europe, there will be between 70 and 80 million fewer Europeans alive than are alive today. That's incredible. You couldn't do that with 3 nuclear bombs and a plague. It's never happened in history like that. By the way, do you know which countries have the lowest birth rate in the entire world? It's Italy and Spain. The birth rate in those countries is 1.2. It's interesting, they're very Catholic countries. With a birth rate of 1.2, the working age population will drop by 30% over the next 20 years. Can you imagine that? Think about your city, your town, your village. Take 30% of the working age population out and try and imagine what that would look like. Who's in the shops? Who's in the malls? Who's in the schools? Where are the workers? This is what's happening now in Europe. The birth rate in Germany is about 1.3. You ask a German teenager, how many cousins have you got? Kid says, what's a cousin? You know, if you have one child, and the child grows up and marries someone who was also an only child, and then they have one child, there are no aunts, no uncles, no cousins. That's what's been happening. This has been a catastrophe for Western Europe. Most of the West European countries have responded by importing workers to replace the children who aren't there. Who are they importing? Muslims. And these Muslims are not being integrated into Western European society. They're remaining a thing apart. Today, the Muslim population of countries like France and Germany is pushing 10% and getting higher very, very quickly. By the way, that's one reason the West Europeans won't join us in the war on terror. They're afraid of their own Muslim populations just exploding on them. The same problem's happening in Japan. The birth rate in Japan is about 1.3. That means when my college-age children are my age visiting Japan, there will be between 50 and 60 million fewer Japanese alive than are alive today. And because Japanese culture is so different than Western European culture, the Japanese are not importing workers. They're just imploding. The social effects of this are extraordinary, but so are the economic effects. If you don't have workers, you also don't have consumers. And if you don't have workers, you don't have taxpayers. So the European economies are not merely in recession, they're beginning to implode. And then look at Japan. The Japanese economy has been sliding down now for more than 2 years. Property values are falling. You don't build homes when the population is shrinking. How would you like to be in the baby food business in Japan or Europe right now? There are no babies. Who would you be selling to? Who's in the schools? What we're looking at is a long-term economic slide in Western Europe and Japan. And the reason this is so serious is because Western Europe and Japan are 2 of the world's 3 major economic engines. And when they're stalled, the world economy is in trouble. The 3rd big economic engine, of course, is the United States. Today in our country, the birth rate is just about 2. That means it's a slow glide path down. Not as bad as the Europeans, but still trending in the same direction. The increase in our population comes from immigration. So we are having a larger population, but it's by immigration. But the actual domestic birth rate is down. It's only about 2. Here's why that's so serious. There's something that the economists call the elderly dependency ratio. What it means is that as the birth rate drops, the percentage of the population that is over 65 becomes bigger, while the working age population shrinks. That's what's happening now in Europe. That's why they're in such terrible economic trouble. It's beginning to happen here in the United States. And the real problem is going to hit us in the next 6 to 8 years as more and more of the baby boomers retire, as they step aside. We simply haven't got enough of a working age population to support the retired people. It's just that simple. You know, we seem to have forgotten. Children are not only a blessing, but they're consumers. They buy stuff. As especially my kids, and then they grow up and they become taxpayers. If we had a higher birth rate, we wouldn't have a Social Security crisis, a Medicare crisis, or a Medicaid crisis. We'd have the tax base. But we haven't done that. So here's what we've got. We've got the external attack on Western civilization from the War on Terror. We've got what amounts to a second civil war in the United States. And throughout Western civilization, we have a declining population base, a demographic problem. This is a very serious combination of threats, and we're going to need to deal with all of them simultaneously. That's a big order. Let's start with the War on Terror. To some extent, we have to think about the War on Terror as though it was a tumor. You know, you can ignore a tumor for a while, but when you do finally realize it's time to deal with that tumor, you'd better get 100% of it. If you get 80% of a tumor, the 20% you leave will grow back and kill you. You've got to get it all. It's the same with the War on Terror. We've got to get it all. So far, we've done a very good job stopping Al-Qaeda, disposing of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Our troops have done a marvelous job in Iraq. They've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and that's a tremendous victory, not just for the United States, but for civilization itself. But this war is a long way from being over. We'll have to keep pushing through. We'll deal with Iran, with Syria, with Yemen, with North Korea, with the countries that have weapons of mass destruction and that are rogue states. This doesn't mean we'll need to invade other countries the way we did with Iraq. Different countries may require different responses, different ways to get at it, and honorable people are going to disagree about the best way to do that. That's fine. Our political system can accommodate that. But the one thing we have to realize is that we'd better keep going till we get 100%, because if we leave anything, it'll come back even stronger and then kill us. Now, all of that will stop the attacks by the terrorists, by the radicals on us, and that's important, but it's not sufficient. In the long run, we want something much more important than that. I said earlier that Western civilization took off back in the 15th and 16th centuries when Judaism and Christianity reconciled with the modern world. Islam has never done that. Islam today is what it was back in the 7th centuries. With very few exceptions, the Islamic countries have never separated church and state, never developed the concept of individual rights, human rights, women's rights. They've never developed the idea of economic liberty or even the rule of law. That's why they're such a mess. What we want is for Islam to do what Judaism and Christianity did so long ago, to reconcile with the modern world. By fighting this war on terrorism, we may be able to create conditions in that part of the world where the moderates can take power from the radicals. That's what this is all about. If you look at what we've had to do in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we've had to knock the radicals out of there using our military power to do it because nobody else had that military power. And we've created a climate where for the first time in a very long while, the moderates can take political power. What we want is for the moderates over time to modernize Islam. Look, there are many, many Islamic people who are moderate, who understand this, who want to reconcile Islam with the modern world. We're giving them a chance to do that. We can't do it. Only they can do it. They're there. Whether this takes 5 years, 50 years, or 300 years, we don't know. I tend to be an optimist. I think it'll be sooner rather than later, but we don't know. But what we want is for Islam to join us in the 21st century. They can do that. Then we're going to be safe. And I think it's going to be a better world for them as well. So that's what the war on terrorism really is about. to give Islam a chance to join Judaism and Christianity in the modern world in the 21st century. As for the other threats, we're going to have to deal with those as well. First, this second civil war within the United States. That's a rough political battle. We're just going to have to fight it out at every local, federal, state level there is. At the same time, we're going to have to do a much better job in our education system. I said earlier that we haven't taught our children very much about Western civilization. You know, if you come to the town where I live and you ask a bunch of high school students, what's Western civilization? They'll look at you for a moment and say, slavery, the oppression of women, and we don't recycle. And you say, well, is that it? And they say, yeah, I think so. Well, it isn't. We've got to teach them how we became who we are. Roger Kimball, one of this country's most brilliant commentators, once wrote that we have been living off the accumulated capital of Western civilization for so long that we've forgotten the heroic effort it took to accumulate that capital in the first place. Well, it's time we started teaching our children about it so they can understand it. And as they grow up, they can defend it. And we're going to have to understand that this agenda by these other people who want to, in effect, overthrow the American Revolution is not something we're going to allow. That we do believe that individuals are more important than groups. That responsibilities are every bit as important as rights. And that people's private morality really is more important than their stand on a public issue. And while of course we want to keep the separation of church and state, we want religion to be part of the public square. We don't want to become the kind of secular anti-religious society that they want to impose on us. And by the way, it does not take a village to raise a child. It takes two parents. Those are the kinds of things we're going to have to fight about. And that really amounts to a second civil war. Then we've got the demographic problem. Now that's an interesting one. There's not much we can do about the Europeans and the Japanese. They're caught now in a vortex. The situation has gone so far in those countries, it's so bad, that even if they made a decision today to try and reverse their demographic trends, it would take more than 2 generations to reverse it. They're going to have a larger population base to have a second larger population base. It's going to be a long time before they can turn things around, and that's going to be an economic catastrophe for these countries. Here in the United States, we have a little more time. As I say, it's about 6 to 8 years before the real problem hits as more and more of those baby boomers hit retirement, and that so-called elderly dependency ratio gets higher and higher and higher. We've got to get cracking. Certainly, we need to teach our children the importance of families. You know, it's funny, we're the most advanced society in the world, but we seem to have forgotten everything that a primitive society knew. You need kids. You know, children are not only a blessing, but they're your consumer base, and they grow up and they become your tax base. We seem to have forgotten that. We've all had experience watching some childless, yuppie couple in a restaurant complaining when somebody's kid is running around making noise. That kid is their retirement. And they'd better understand that. We had better make sure that we keep marriage and family at the center of our political life, and that any threats to the concepts of marriage and family, we stop. Because if we let that go, we're going to lose this, and we're going to lose it bad. A few months back, I gave a talk at one of our country's leading colleges, and I said something that got some people upset. I said, look, I like intelligent, educated women. I'm married to one. My daughter's in college. But you know, right now in the United States, we need one more mom, more than we need one more tax attorney. That didn't sit very well with some of those college girls. But that's where we are. We are going to need a larger population base. By the way, think about the millions and millions of babies who've been aborted during the last couple of decades. Now, that's a human tragedy. But do you know it's also an economic tragedy? If those children had been allowed to live, we would not have the problem we have now. We'd have the consumer base, we'd have the tax base, we wouldn't be facing a Social Security and Medicare crisis. Isn't that amazing? We never think about it that way. That's the case. Back after World War II ended, we understood that we needed a larger population base. That's where that $600 per child income tax credit came from. The idea was to make it possible for a family, mother, father, and 4 kids to be off the tax rolls so that mom and dad could raise their family and afford to be able to do it. Recently, the per child tax break has been raised from $600 to $1,000, just when my kids get past it, of course. Do you know what the per child tax credit would have to be to match what we did in 1948? It would have to be $12,000 per child. Whether we can do that, I don't know, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude of what we're going to have to think about. And that's a very serious kind of problem. Even if we start to do things like that, we're facing a healthcare crisis because we haven't got the tax base. We may have to contemplate things that we really don't want to do. Can we continue to provide health care for illegal aliens? Can we continue to provide the kind of goofy, esoteric healthcare services, such as aromatherapy, that's pushing up everybody's healthcare premiums? Other countries put age limits on some medical procedures. For example, age limits on heart transplants, quadruple bypass surgeries, hip replacements. We don't do that in the United States, and we don't want to do that in the United States. But if we can't solve this kind of problem, we may have to do that. So because our birth rates have been too low, we may have to look at policies that are going to make us very uncomfortable and that are politically going to be very difficult and very unpopular. But that's the jam we're in, and we're going to have to think about things like that, whether we want to or not. There's one other thing we're going to have to do that is so radical I almost hesitate to suggest it. We are going to have to start electing people who actually know what they're talking about. How's that for a radical idea? Now, the truth is, we do elect some good people in the United States. You know, we elect some very good people. But we don't elect enough of them. All too often, we elect people for public office who pose, who preen, who tell us they feel our pain, they're sympathetic with us, they're fighting for us every day, but somehow they never accomplish anything. They never solve any of the problems. They spend most of their time trying to trick us into thinking they're working at it, but never actually getting anywhere. And if only we'd re-elect them, things would be okay, but they never are. We're going to have to pay a lot more attention to the kind of people we elect in the United States. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal, a conservative, green, independent. There are honorable, hardworking people of good character across the political spectrum. These are the kinds of people we need to bring into politics. We've got to push aside the ones who are playing politics just because that's their business. By the way, I've got to tell you one political story. Back in 2002, I was a candidate for the Republican nomination for Congress in my home district where I live in Washington State. And one afternoon, I was sitting with a prominent business executive in the district trying to get his support. He operated a chain of funeral parlors, as it happened. And I made my pitch to him, and he listened. And he said, "Herb, I can't support you, even though you're obviously the most qualified candidate in the race." And I said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Because you couldn't possibly win the election." And I said, "Well, why can't I win if I'm the most qualified candidate?" He looked at me and he said, "Herb, you're not huggable." I realized that evening I had been called unhuggable by a mortician. That's the night I knew my campaign was in trouble. No wonder somebody once said that politics is show business for ugly people. There's a point there. We're going to have to start turning to people with the knowledge, with the background, with the character to solve our country's problems. No matter what political party you prefer, no matter what political party they come from, let's get the right people in there and work together to put in place the policies that will get us through the problem. We can do this. There's nothing here that's beyond our capabilities. You know, the situation is we're in check. We're not in checkmate. We still have time to work our way out of this, to fight our way out of this, to think our way out of this. We can do it. And I believe it's worth doing. Western civilization is history's greatest achievement. It is our responsibility to make sure that when we step off stage, when we turn things over to our children's generation, Western civilization is in place and they have the knowledge and the character and the integrity to continue to defend it. And so this is the task that has fallen to us. We are charged with the responsibility to rescue Western civilization. I can't imagine anything more worth doing than that. If we can understand the threats, if we can understand what we need to do to deal with these threats, we can make our cultural environment as important to us as the physical environment is important to us. We can make this a healthier world for ourselves and for our children. So please, let's rescue Western civilization, not just for our own sake, not even for the sake of our own children. Let's rescue Western civilization for the sake of all humanity. Thank you for listening to me. I'm Herb Meyer.
Herb Meyer served during the Reagan administration as Special Assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence and Vice Chairman of the CIA's National Intelligence Council. In these positions, he managed production of the U.S. National Intelligence Estimates and other top-secret projections for the President and his senior national security advisors. Mr. Meyer is widely credited with being the first senior U.S. government official to forecast the Soviet Union's collapse, which he did in the early 1980s, to considerable political derision. He was later awarded the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, which is the intelligence community's highest honor. Prior to his service with the U.S. government, Herb Meyer was an associate editor of Fortune, where he was among the magazine's top international specialists. He is author of several books, including Real-World Intelligence, The War Against Progress, and Hard Thinking. And with his wife Jill, he is co-author of How to Write, a handbook used widely at colleges throughout the world. Mr. Meyer's articles and essays on politics and about our country's intelligence service in the wake of 9/11 have been published in the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, and Policy Review. He is a frequent guest on leading television news programs. If you would like to learn more about Mr. Meyer's books and essays, please visit the website of Storm King Press at www.stormkingpress.com. And if you would like additional copies of Herb Meyer's The Siege of Western Civilization, please visit www.siegeofwesternciv.com or call 1-800-393-1266 to place your order.